Chapter 22 of The Hero by W. Somerset Maugham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In solitary walks James had found his only consolation. He knew even in that populous district unfrequented parts where he could wander without fear of interruption. Among the trees and the flowers, in the broad meadows, he forgot himself, and, his senses sharpened by long absence, he learned for the first time the exquisite charm of English country. He loved the spring, with its yellow, countless buttercups, spread over the green fields like a cloth of gold, whereon might fitly walk the angels of Messer Perugino. The colours were so delicate that one could not believe it possible for paints and paint-brush to reproduce them. The atmosphere visibly surrounded things, softening their outlines. Sometimes from a hill higher than the rest, James looked down at the plain bathed in golden sunlight. The fields of corn, the fields of clover, the roads and the rivulets, formed themselves in that flood of light into an harmonious pattern, luminous and ethereal. A pleasant reverie filled his mind, unanalysable, a waking dream of half voluptuous sensation. On the other side of the common, James knew a wood of tall fir trees, dark and ragged, their sombre green veiled in a silvery mist, as though, like a chill vapour, the hoar frost of 100 winters still lingered among their branches. At the edge of the hill, up which they climbed in serried hundreds, stood here and there an oak tree, just bursting into leaf, clothed with its new-born verdure, like the bride of the young god, Spring. And the everlasting youth of the oak tree contrasted wonderfully with the undying age of the firs. Then later, in the height of the summer, James found the pine wood cool and silent, fitting his humour. It was like the forest of life, the grey and sombre labyrinth where wandered the poet of hell and death. The tall trees rose straight and slender, like the barren masts of sailing ships. The gentle aromatic odour, the light subdued, the purple mist, so faint as to be scarcely discernible, a mere tinge of warmth in the day, all gave him an exquisite sense of rest. Here he could forget his trouble and give himself over to the love which seemed his real life. Here the recollection of Mrs. Wallace gained flesh and blood, seeming so real that he almost stretched out his arms to seize her. His footfall on the brown needles was noiseless, and the tread was soft and easy. The odours filled him like an Eastern drug, with drowsy intoxication. But all that now was gone, when, unbidden, the well-known laugh rang again in his ears, for he felt on his hands the touch of slender fingers. James turned away with a gesture of distaste. Now Mrs. Wallace had brought him only bitterness, and he tortured himself insanely, trying to forget her. With tenfold force, the sensation returned which had so terribly oppressed him before his illness. He felt that nature had become intolerably monotonous. The circumscribed, prim country was horrible. On every inch of it the hand of man was apparent. It was a prison, and his hands and feet were chained with heavy iron. The dark, immovable clouds were piled upon one another in giant masses, so distinct and sharply cut, so rounded, that one almost saw the impressure of the fingers of some titanic sculptor. And they hung low down, overwhelming, so that James could scarcely breathe. The sombre elms were too well ordered, the meadows too carefully tended. All round, the hills were dark and drear, and that very fertility, that fat scantish luxuriance, added to the oppression. It was a task impossible to escape from that iron circle. All power of flight abandoned him. Oh, he loathed it. The past centuries of people, living in a certain way, with certain standards, influenced by certain emotions, were too strong for him. James was like a foolish bird, a bird born in a cage, without power to attain its freedom. His lust for a free life was futile. He acknowledged, with cruel self-contempt, that he was weaker than a woman, ineffectual. He could not lead the life of his little circle, purposeless and untrue, and yet he had not power to lead the life of his own, uncertain, vacillating, torn between the old and the new. His reason led him. His conscience drew him back, but the ties of his birth and ancestry were too strong. He had not the energy even of the poor tramp, who carries with him his whole fortune, and leaves in the lap of the gods the uncertain future. James envied with all his heart the beggar boy, wandering homeless and penniless, but free. He, at least, had not these inhuman fetters which it was death to suffer and death to cast off. He, indeed, could make the world his servant. Freedom! Freedom! If one were only unconscious of captivity, what would it matter? It is the knowledge that kills. And James walked again by the neat iron railing which enclosed the fields, his head aching with the rigidity and decorum, wishing vainly for just one piece of barren, unkept land to remind him that all the world was not a prison. Already the autumn had come. The rich, mouldering colours were like an air melancholy with the approach of inevitable death. But in those passionate tints, in the red and gold of the apples, in the many tones of the first fallen leaves, there was still something which forbade one to forget that in the death and decay of nature there was always the beginning of other life. Yet to James the autumn heralded death, with no consoling afterthought. He had nothing to live for since he knew that Mrs. Wallace could never love him. His love for her had borne him up and sustained him, but now it was hateful and despicable. After all, his life was his own to do what he liked with. The love of others had no right to claim his self-respect. If he had duties to them, he had duties to himself also. And more vehemently than ever, James felt that such a union as was before him could only be a degradation. He repeated with new emotion that marriage without love was prostitution. If death was the only way in which he could keep clean that body ignorantly despised, why, he was not afraid of death. He had seen it too often for the thought to excite alarm. It was but a common, mechanical process, quickly finished and not more painful than could be borne. The flesh is all which is certainly immortal. The dissolution of consciousness is the signal of new birth. Out of corruption springs fresh life, like the roses from a Roman tomb, and the body, one with the earth, pursues the eternal round. But one day James told himself impatiently that all these thoughts were mad and foolish. He could only have them because he was still out of health. Life, after all, was the most precious thing in the world. It was absurd to throw it away like a broken toy. He rebelled against the fate which seemed forcing itself upon him. He determined to make the effort and, come what might, break the hateful bonds. It only required a little courage, a little strength of mind. If others suffered, he had suffered too. The sacrifice they demanded was too great. But when he returned to Primpton House, the inevitability of it all forced itself once again upon him. He shrugged his shoulders despairingly. It was no good. The whole atmosphere oppressed him so that he felt powerless. Some hidden influence surrounded James, sucking from his blood, as it were, all manliness, dulling his brain, He became a mere puppet, acting in accordance to principles that were not his own, automatic, willless. His father sat as ever in the dining-room by the fire, for only in the warmest weather would he do without artificial heat. And he read the paper, sometimes aloud, making little comments. His mother, at the table, on a stiff-backed chair, was knitting, everlastingly knitting. Outwardly there was in them a placid content, and a gentleness which made them seem pliant as wax. But really they were iron. James knew at last how pitiless was their love, how inhumanly cruel their intolerance. And of the two, his father seemed more implacable, more horribly relentless. His mother's anger was bearable, but the Colonel's very weakness was a deadly weapon. His despair, his dumb sorrow, his entire dependence on the forbearance of others were more tyrannical than the most despotic power. James was indeed a bird beating himself against the imprisoning cage, and his bars were loving-kindness and trust, tears, silent distress, bitter disillusion, and old age. "Where's Mary?" asked James. "She's in the garden walking with Uncle William." "How will they get on together?" said the Colonel, smiling. James looked at his father and thought he had never seen him so old and feeble. His hands were almost transparent. His thin white hair, his bowed shoulders, gave an impression of utter weakness. "Are you very glad the wedding is so near, father?" asked James, placing his hand gently on the old man's shoulder. "I should think I was." "You want to get rid of me so badly?" "A man shall leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. We shall have to do without you." "I wonder whether you're fonder of Mary than of me." The Colonel did not answer, but Mrs. Parsons laughed. "My impression is that your father has grown so devoted to Mary that he hardly thinks you worthy of her." "Really? And yet you want me to marry her, don't you, Daddy?" "It's the wish of my heart." "Were you very wretched when our engagement was broken off?" "Don't talk of it. Now it is all settled, Jamie. I can tell you that I'd sooner see you dead at my feet than that you should break your word to Mary." James laughed. "And you, mother?" he asked, lightly. She did not answer, but looked at him earnestly. "What, you too? Would you rather see me dead and not married than marry? What a bloodthirsty pair you are!" James, laughing, spoke so gaily, it never dawned on them that his words meant more than was obvious. And yet, he felt that they, laughing but implacable, had signed his death warrant. With smiling faces they had thrown open the portals of their house, and he, smiling, was ready to enter. Mary at that moment came in, followed by Uncle William. "Well, James, there you are!" she cried, in that hard, metallic voice which to James betrayed so obviously the meanness of her spirit and her self-complacency. "Where on earth have you been?" She stood by the table, strict, uncompromising, self-reliant. By her immaculate virtue, by the strength of her narrow will, she completely domineered the others. She felt herself capable of managing them all, and in fact had been giving Uncle William a friendly little lecture upon some action of which she disapproved. Mary had left off her summer things and wore again the plain serge skirt, and because it was rainy, the battered straw hat of the preceding winter. She was using up her old things, and having got all possible wear out of them, intended on the day before her marriage generously to distribute them among the poor. "Is my face very red?" she asked. "There's a lot of wind today." To James She had never seemed more unfeminine. That physical repulsion which at first had terrified him now was growing into an ungovernable hate. Everything Mary did irritated and exasperated him. He wondered she did not see the hatred in his eyes as she looked at her, answering her question. "No, no," he said to himself. "I would rather shoot myself than marry you." His dislike was unreasonable, but he could not help it, and the devotion of his parents made him detest her all the more. He could not imagine what they saw in her. With hostile glance he watched her movements as she took off her hat and arranged her hair, grimly drawn back and excessively neat. She fetched her knitting from Mrs. Parsons' work-basket and sat down. All her actions had in them an insufferable air of patronage, and she seemed more than usually pleased with herself. James had an insane desire to hurt her, to ruffle that self-satisfaction, and he wanted to say something that should wound her to the quick. And all the time he laughed and jested as though he were in the highest spirits. "And what were you doing this morning, Mary?" asked Colonel Parsons. "Oh, I biked into Tunbridge Wells with Mr. Dryland to play golf. He plays a rattling good game." "Did he beat you?" "Well, no," she answered modestly. "It so happened that I beat him. But he took his thrashing remarkably well. Some men get so angry when they are beaten by a girl." "The curate has many virtues," said James. "He was talking about you, Jamie. He said he thought you disliked him, but I told him of a certain you didn't. He's really such a good man, one can't help liking him. He said he'd like to teach you golf." "And is he going to?" "Certainly not. I mean to do that myself." "There are many things you want to teach him, Mary. You'll have your hands full." "Oh, by the way, father told me to remind you and Uncle William that you were shooting with him the day after tomorrow. You're to fetch him at 10. "I hadn't forgotten," replied James. "Uncle William, we shall have to clean our guns tomorrow." James had come to a decision at last, and meant to waste no time. Indeed, there was none to waste, and to remind him how near was the date fixed for the wedding, were the preparations almost complete. 1 or 2 presents had already arrived. With all his heart he thanked his father and mother for having made way easier for him. He thought what he was about to do the kindest thing both to them and to Mary. Under no circumstances could he marry her. That would be adding a greater lie to those which he had already been forced into, and the misery was more than he could bear. But his death was the only other way of satisfying their undoubted claims. He had little doubt that in 6 months he would be as well forgotten as poor Regulator, and he did not care. He was sick of the whole business and wanted the quiet of death. His love for Mrs. Wallace would never give him peace upon earth. It was utterly futile and yet unconquerable. James saw his opportunity in Colonel Clibborn's invitation to shoot. He was most anxious to make the affair seem accidental, and that in cleaning his gun was easy. He had been wounded before, and knew that the pain was not very great. He had therefore nothing to fear. Now at last he regained his spirits. He did not read or walk, but spent the day talking with his father. He wished the last impression he would leave to be as charming as possible, and took great pains to appear at his best. He slept well that night, and in the morning dressed himself with unusual care. At Primpton House they breakfasted at 8, and afterwards James smoked his pipe, reading the paper. He was a little astonished at his calm, but doubt no longer assailed him, and the indecision which paralysed all his faculties had disappeared. "It is the beginning of my freedom," he thought. All human interests had abandoned him, except a vague sensation of amusement. He saw the humour of the comedy he was acting, and dispassionately approved himself. because he did not give way to histrionics. "Well, Uncle William," he said at last, "what d'you say to setting to work on our guns?" "I'm always ready for everything," said Major Forsyth. "Come on, then." They went into what they called the harness room, and James began carefully to clean his gun. "I think I'll take my coat off," he said. "I can work better without." The gun had not been used for several months, and James had a good deal to do. He leaned over and rubbed a little rust off the lock. "Upon my word," said Uncle William, "I've never seen anyone handle a gun so carelessly as you. Do you call yourself a soldier?" "I'm a bit slack," replied James, laughing. "People are always telling me that." "Well, take care, for goodness' sake. It may be loaded." "Oh, no, there's no danger. It's not loaded, and besides it's locked." "Still, you oughtn't to hold it like that." "It would be rather comic if I killed myself accidentally. I wonder what Mary would say." "Well, you've escaped death so often by the skin of your teeth, I think you're pretty safe from everything but old age." Presently James turned to his uncle. "I say, this is rotten oil. I wish we could get some fresh." "I was just thinking that." "Well, you're a pal of the cook. Go and ask her for some. There's a good chap." "She'll do anything for me," said Major Forsyth, with a self-satisfied smile. It was his opinion that no woman, countess or scullery maid, could resist his fascinations, and taking the cup he trotted off. James immediately went to the cupboard and took out a cartridge. He slipped it in, rested the butt on the ground, pointed the barrel to his heart, and fired. End of chapter 22.